I'm Michael Delamonte, and welcome to the Eyeopener, the radio broadcast and podcast bringing you behind the scenes on stories reported by Ryerson University's independent student newspaper, the Eyeopener. Coming out is hard to do. Speaking from personal experience, the act of announcing to the world, including your closest friends and family, that you're queer can be terrifying, to put it mildly. But once you do utter the words, "I'm gay," or the like, things get easier. Not always, of course, but nowadays people tend to be more accepting of queer identities. Well, at least when it comes to gay men and women. Other sexual identities on the queer spectrum aren't afforded the same level of understanding and acceptance gay individuals enjoy today. Case in point, bisexuality. Described as a pit stop to gay or a confused state of experimentation, bisexuality is regularly dismissed, or worse, wholly denigrated. Biphobia manifests in many other ways, and most often, people aren't even aware their remarks are adding to the stigma surrounding bisexuality. Former photo and news editor Sarah Krishel wrote a narrative feature on biphobia and the issues facing bisexual people for the Eyeopener's annual Love and Sex issue, On Stands Now. To discuss the piece and the larger conversation on biphobia, Sarah joins me on this week's episode of the Eyeopener. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Let's clear some misconceptions up first. Being bisexual doesn't necessarily mean you're attracted to every guy and every girl. Speaking for yourself and some of your sources, how does attraction work for a bisexual individual?
So I think that the way it works is kind of just like anybody else's attraction. It doesn't mean that you're attracted to every single person that you see on the street. It just means that you might see somebody that you like, regardless of their gender. You kind of just appreciate the person for who they are, and that's like the best way I can explain it. I find that the difference and the kind of the barrier between a straight person and somebody who identifies along the queer spectrum, they think that it's works very differently, or they think that, you know, you're just attracted to everybody you see on the street, but it's very much the same. Like, if you're attracted to somebody, you're attracted to somebody, and that's kind of the end of it. You know, you'll be around a friend who you just came out to, and then all of a sudden they think that you must be attracted to them because they are a woman and you are also a woman.
And I think back in the day, being gay kind of overtook a person's character, but nowadays, with the general public being a little bit more knowledgeable and actually exposed to queer individuals, that's like not quite the case. But is this still a problem for bisexual people where their sexual preferences kind of overshadow their personhood?
Yeah, okay, so I think that the easiest way to do this is to kind of speak from my own experience.
Okay.
So I guess when I came out to a certain couple of friends, they kind of started just assuming that you would be attracted to anybody that you see. So like every conversation, when you see somebody who's relatively attractive, me being a woman, and then another person, like another woman who passed by who's relatively attractive, they might assume that I'm attracted to this person. You get the sense that people perceive you as constantly just always having sex on the brain for some reason. It's a really weird thing. That's why biphobia is like a very strange topic, and it's very nuanced, the problems that come with it, because it's very much an implicit problem of the kinds of things that you can't always put your finger on. So yeah, it is very much being hypersexualized in the sense of the things that you want or the things that you're thinking about, or like every kind of conversation and discourse goes in that direction.
Let's expand upon that a little bit. How does biphobia kind of play out in the everyday? Bisexuality is often dismissed as not being a real thing. How do people express that without specifically saying it?
Yeah, so very often when a bisexual person will come out to a friend of theirs or to their family, people who are relatively accepting of just being gay or being queer or being trans, those types of things, people will often get the response that it's just a phase. So there is that very typical common trope of, you know, being in college and being in university or post-secondary, whatever, and you start to experiment and you start to do things that are a little crazy, or you're a drunk girl at a club who's just going to make out with another girl. Like those types of tropes that we see in the media and that we constantly see, like those things are normal. They're entirely normal. But that doesn't mean that encapsulates the bisexual community. That's not who the bisexual community is. So I think that it manifests itself very much in that way, just these presumptions that these people are just trying to explore and discover themselves. And that can very much be the case for one individual who identifies as bisexual, but the next individual who identifies as bisexual could be completely sure of who they are. They could have known since they were in middle school, they could have known since they were like a little kid, whatever.
Moving away from more anecdotal evidence, Are there any studies demonstrating the negative repercussions of biphobia? And do queer-focused organizations really cater to the needs of bisexual individuals in this kind of respect?
Studies that focus specifically on how LGBTQ plus people are treated in society, they do tend to overlook the B in the acronym. Even in our own local bookstores, we can't find enough resources, whether that be research or whether that be support or whether that be peer groups or allies, anything like that. We can't even find those things on our own bookshelves. It's difficult when the spots that you go to for support, similar to how you might go to the LGBTQ community, the people that you know in that community for support, and you can't find it there, and then you go to the bookstores that cater to queer specific content or resources of some sort or education, and then there's only a shelf worth of content there as well. And that's because we don't see much content on bisexuality specifically come out. It's always catering to fitting into one slot only. So whether you're gay or straight, it's going to be specific to like gay, lesbian, trans. We're seeing sort of an increase. Glad Day Bookshop, which is down the street from Ryerson, is seeing an increase in that kind of content. But again, it's limited right now, and it's difficult for those individuals to find that support right now, which is a problem.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I'd like to talk about the media for a second, specifically the entertainment industry. Obviously, gay has been commodified to a certain extent, specifically in Hollywood, for better or worse. And gay characters are now kind of a norm in TV and movies. But what about bisexual characters? Does the stark lack of bisexual characters propagate the general dismissal of bisexuality?
As it stands, bisexuality is just seen as a phase overall. The lack of representation does kind of allude to the fact that it just doesn't exist. So I think current TV shows and movies, they are taking advantage of gay identities, not because they want to be more inclusive, but because it's trendy and because we're trying to appeal to the younger audience, and more people are out now. But it does very much leave out certain individuals who need that representation, and so it does very much contribute to the idea that no, like, these people don't exist, and if they do exist, like, oh, you must be lying, like, you must just be doing it for attention, or you must be trying to come up with an excuse for yourself when you want to hook up with a girl, and then you go back to being straight, or you haven't even had sex with a woman. Like, how would you know? Like the representation in the media is what contributes to those types of thought processes when you do encounter somebody who says, I identify as bisexual. And yeah, it does contribute to this idea that no, I'm going to invalidate who you are because I don't hear about it and because I know nothing about it and I don't learn about it. So the media is a huge factor in that.
And can you name me a positive representation of a bisexual character? I could really only think of one, because at least in the media I consumed, I've seen the trend of making bisexual characters kind of manipulative, like they kind of play both sides to their own ends. Do you have any good or bad examples?
The only times that I really do see anything alluding to bisexual identities is in a horror movie where there's a loving husband and a loving wife and they're both white and everybody's white, and then all of a sudden another woman is trying to seduce the wife in the relationship, and then they get together and everything's all seductive and horny, and those kinds of tropes is really the only representation I see. I've yet to see a positive representation of bisexuality, and if anybody has any tips, hit me up. But I think it just speaks volumes to the fact that I can't think of a positive one right now in the times that I have seen it.
And what about the news end of the media spectrum? What is reporting like on bisexuality and bisexual individuals?
Unless we're speaking specifically about the blood ban or about, I don't know, some other specific identity-specific topic within that community, it's always going to be about pride, or it's always going to be about STDs, like that kind of stuff. So I find that even reporting specifically on bisexuality is something you hardly see. That's why we put the piece out. But any identity along the spectrum, it's never really specific to them, and it's always a very generalized thing. So that's why I think it's important to speak more specifically to the identities across the spectrum. So when we're talking about race, we're going specifically into different people's experiences. But when we're talking about LGBTQ+, we're never going into the specific identities, which is interesting because everybody lives their life very differently. Just because people use the same rainbow flag doesn't mean that they don't have their own flags. And so I think that it's also the onus is also on the media and on news outlets to be more specific in that kind of addressing of different types of issues, and also just embedding LGBTQ plus people within their regular news stories, because they don't just exist for those specific stories. They exist in general, and they're affected by every other issue that exists in the world. So I think that representation also lacks.
And what about on campus or even in the city? What types of resources exist for bisexual individuals? Would they necessarily be welcome at like the Pride Center?
If you are bisexual, you're basically going to be seen as not belonging and kind of a fake queer. So bisexual people, whether you want to go to those institutions for help or whether you want to work there and help other people, you're just kind of seen as an other, and you're not accepted very much as automatically as other people are. And I think that's the most frustrating part for a bi person.
And as a closing remark, what can allies, both straight and queer, do to dismantle the stigma surrounding bisexuality?
I think that my number one advice is to stop questioning people. It comes a lot with identity politics, people kind of questioning what your experience is, and people saying, like, stop exaggerating, or, yeah, sure, like, I'm sure it's not that bad, that kind of thing. With identity politics, that's a very, very common way of going into the discourse. And for bisexual people, it's almost the automatic, it's something that you kind of have to deal with upon coming out to anybody. Some people don't even properly come out. They might just say, oh yeah, like I go for any gender, I don't really care. And, automatically people just don't believe them. So I think it's really important to just, upon hearing something like that, just don't question it. Know that the person who is telling you this told you for a reason, and know that they know themselves better than you do. And by making any sort of comment like that, by alluding to anything like that, it can be really, really harmful. So it's good to address those things openly. If you have any questions, ask the person if you think that you are in a close enough position to be asking them that. But don't question it, and don't assume that you know better than somebody else. Whether you're gay or straight, they know themselves better than you do.
Good advice, and that is time. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Anytime. Here's what else you should be reading this week. In news, what steps Ryerson needs to take to become waste-free, and what happens when you get stuck on an elevator on campus. And more in the love and sex issue, an exploration into the biological and psychological roots of kink. And here we are at the end of the ear opener for this Friday, February 16th. Be sure to pick up this week's print edition of the Eyeopener or head to theeyeopener.com. I'm Michael Delamonte, and until next time, keep your eyes and ears open.